Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be going over Phase 2 gearing for rogues in TBC Classic. This is going to include the Tier 5 new items from SSC and Tempest Keep, as well as some of the crafted items that you can, the recipes drop in those zones as well. And also, I guess one PvP item. So there's that. Now, when it comes to gearing for your rogue, you're going to be using a few items from Tier 4. So you're going to continue using Drape of Dark Reavers, the Choker of Vile Intent, Edgewalker Long Boots, and DST. Now, for a lot of you, you're also going to continue using your Latros unless you are getting able to get a Gladiator offhand. But that is what's going to carry over from Tier 4 content. Now, the new items you're getting in Tier 5, you're going to be using 4-set Death Mantle. You can see the 4-set here says your attacks have a chance to make your next finishing move cost no energy. Right now, according to Simon's spreadsheet, I'll have a link to the description below. It appears to be very, very powerful. Even if there was if the proc is drastically overestimated, it still seems to be extremely potent. For reference, right now the proc is so powerful that if you were to look at DPS increase, it's about an 80 DPS increase, which is very large in terms of the rogue's contribution, according to the Simon spreadsheet, which is, again, 80 DPS is insane. And even if the proc is half as good as we think, 40 DPS is still insane. Even if it's a quarter, 20 DPS is still worth using, right? So it looks like it's going to be insane. And even if it's the 4-set's not quite as good as we think, it's still going to be really good. So Death Mantle is looking insane. So you definitely do want to run that 4-set, but you're going to see that 2-set is pretty underwhelming. So just keep that in mind as you're gearing up, and we'll go more into that later. But yeah, it's all about the 4-set when it comes to Death Mantle. Now, the other new items you're going to be getting in the phase, you're going to have your offset piece that you pair with Death Mantle. So that's either going to be the Bloodsea Brigand Vest or Shoulders of the Stranger, depending on what drops, what's easier to get, and potentially what helps your gear set up more. And then you also have new wrists that are best in slot, finally replacing your heroic dungeon wrists from the previous phase. And then we also have some new rings, a trinket, and a ranged weapon. So starting with the ring, we've got, 2 rings that are about equally good. You've got your Warp Spring Coil, which is a rogue-only trinket, which is really good. Not DSD good, but, definitely best in slot. And then you also have Arcanite Steam Pistol. And last but not least, obviously, we have the new sword, Talon of Ashara. Now, there's some other weapons as well, but Talon of Ashara is going to be the best one, unless Rod of the Sun King is miraculously has an insane proc rate and is way better than anyone's expecting, which is not likely to be the case. So with that, let's go a little more in detail to each of the items. And I also skipped over the belt, by the way. Don't forget the belt. The belt is very good from Lady Vash. I didn't mention the belt, but yeah, very good item. So let's kind of talk about each of the items, how long they're going to last, how much value they provide, and kind of give you an idea of how good each item is that you're getting, so you can kind of get an idea of, when you're gearing your character, maybe what you should be keeping your eye out for. So the first thing I want to talk about is the items that are best in slot in the next phase. There are 3 items that are going to be best in slot in the next phase. And again, the next phase is actually 2 raids, right? Hyjal and Black Temple, which means, items like this that are best in slot in the next phase, that's really high value. It's going to last you through, the 2 current raids that are going to come out soon here. And then also the next 2 raids, and only getting replaced into Sunwell, which is the last raid in the game, right? These items are not even getting replaced in Zolaman. So these are really, really good. So we've got Belt of 100 Depths. Now let's start with that one. Now this belt is going to have a crazy amount of competition. Every melee DPS wants this thing, and even tanks are likely to want this for their threat sets. But for you as a rogue, it's a very good item. It's best in slot. It's a big upgrade from the second best belt. It's a massive upgrade from what you're probably using right now in Tier 4. Girdle of the Death Dealer, and it's still quite a big upgrade over the crafted Belt of Deep Shadow that you can make coming into Tier 5. Now, again, not much to say about the belt. It's insanely good. Obviously, you'd want to get it. The only catch is that everyone else wants it too. We also have the Warp Spring Coil. Now, this item is best in slot into Sunwell as well. It's a pretty big jump in damage as well. It's not better than DST, but it's still a great trinket. And since you have 2 slots, you're always going to use this. And the only real catch with the Warp Spring Coil is it's rogue only, so you don't really have to worry about other classes. So while this is like a really big item for you, and it's best in slot for another phase, it's kind of like, are you really freaking out over Warp Spring Coil? Probably not, because you're going to get it eventually. Depending on how many rogues you have, it's probably not a big deal to get this item, whereas something like the belt is going to have crazy competition, and depending on your loot system, might have to save DKP for that, might have to make your case as to why you should get it. But yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea of how those items are going to be used. We also have the Arcanite Steam Pistol. Now, this is another item that is best in slot, but into Sunwell. Now, the catch here is that hunters are going to want to use this. There is a bow that is slower and does more DPS, but this thing is a gun. Maybe some dwarves would want to use this over the bow. I think it's kind of close on which one you want to go with if you're a dwarf. But even if you're just any hunter, hunters are going to want the Arcanite Steam Pistol until they have their their best in slot ranged weapon. So you're going to lose these to hunters for a while, but once hunters are all have an epic weapon from tier 5 content, then you can get your Arcanite Steam Pistol, and obviously it's actually a pretty sizable upgrade as well for you, and is a long lasting one as well. So this is a great item. Now, going into the next set of items, now these are basically best in slot in the next phase as well. It's like there's like a slight asterisk. Dallin of Ashara is best in slot in the next phase, even in Black Temple, as long as you don't get the Warglaive, which obviously it's a low drop rate and it's going to be contested, and then unless you also have the sword, which in this would be season 3, should have a higher requirement than even 1850 to get it. Actually, it might still be 1850. I think it's season 4 that they'll bump it up. But long story short, Talon of Ashara, unless you get really lucky with glaives, or unless you're able to get the Gladiator Slicer, it's going to continue being best in slot into tier 6 content as well. Now, Ring of Lethality is the other item. It is basically identical to the Ring of Deceitful Intent, or Deceitful Intent, but Deceitful Intent is like a fraction better. If you look at the 2 items, Lethality has 3 more agility, and Deceitful Intent has 8 more attack power. 8 attack power is a tiny pinch better than 3 agility, but it's very close. So they're pretty much identical. And in reality, if you get Ring of Lethality, you're probably going to use it for until Sunwell. I wouldn't even bother trying to replace it with this item. I would potentially use Deceitful Intent as your second ring. That's probably the most common thing that's going to get you into Sunwell. But there is also another ring that exists called the Band of the Ranger General. Now, this one I would have a little lower on your radar than the Band or the Ring of Lethality. And that's because if you look at the Ring of Lethality, we've got hit, we've got agility, and AP. This is a great rogue item. Now, this is not something that's necessarily going to be great for a warrior, a ret, an enhance. Really mainly an item that would be good for rogues, maybe feral DPS druids, and hunters. Whereas the Band of the Ranger General is really good for everyone, so it would just make more sense, in my point of view, why fight over this ring when you can get the Ring of Lethality much easier? And keep in mind that in the next phase, you've got another ring that you can potentially pick up that's going to be on par with Ranger General as well. But those are the 2 rings to keep an eye out for, both about equal power to the ring in Black Temple, so they can last you into Sunwell. So not technically best in slot for these 3 items, but pretty close. Next, I want to go to items that are best in slot for this phase only. So again, just give you an idea of how long items are going to last, what's your good pieces. Obviously, you've got the wrists, you've got all of the tier, and you've got the chest or the shoulders. Now, it depends if you're using the Death Mantle chest or the Death Mantle shoulders, which is going to be your best in slot. They're almost identical, and I'll go into a little more detail here in a second over which you would choose. But when it comes down to your best in slot for this phase only, it's going to be your tier is going to get replaced in the next phase, and these offset pieces are going to get replaced as well. Now, there's a few other items that are not best in slot in this phase that I think it's worth noting that they're not eventually you're going to get rid of them even in this phase, or you might never even need to pick them up. So just keep an eye out for that. These are items that you potentially could let other classes get. So obviously, whatever tier piece you end up not using, you don't need all 5 pieces of your tier. So one of those pieces, whether it be the shoulder or the chest that you end up not using, that is going to be one of the pieces that you're just going to, end up using an offset piece for. Now, the goggles are about as good as the tier helm. So is definitely something you can use if you have the goggles. You don't have to worry about getting the tier helm until you go for that 4-set bonus. But, technically not best in slot. You also got the Belt of Deep Shadow. Again, worse than the Vash Belt, but the Vash Belt's going to be pretty hard to get. This is from Leatherworking, and it's a new pattern that comes out in Phase 5. You also have the grips, the Searing Grip gloves. Now, these I would be pretty careful. Personally, as a rogue, I would never take these. They're best in slot for a lot of classes. Your Enhances, your Furies, your Rets. A lot of classes are going to want these. Potentially even some tanks might want these as well. And as a rogue, you've just got a piece of tier that's better. And I just listed off a bunch of classes that don't want that item. That's going to increase your chances of getting the tier anyway, at least among the paladins and the shamans that would share the tier with you. We also have Tsunami Talisman. Now, Tsunami Talisman is an item I would, again, personally pass on myself. It's not a big upgrade. It's a pretty minimal difference between the Bloodlust Brooch and, it's not best in slot because you should be using your DST and your warp, what is this thing you call it? Yeah, your warp spring coil. You should be using those 2 trinkets. And so really, I would never take Tsunami Talisman unless no one else wanted it. You could use it as a temporary upgrade until you get both of your best in slot trinkets, or if no one wants it. But yeah, I wouldn't be super high in the Talisman simply because it's just not as good for you as a rogue, and just does not do much more damage than Bloodlust Brute. Honestly, is the main thing. So take that for what you will. Then we also got the items that are just worse than tier 4. Now, these are items like, okay, these items you maybe could consider like, okay, I'm only going to pick these up if no one wants them, or, maybe snag them if it's not a big deal. But these items really, unless you're missing an item from tier 4, I would never go for any of these, especially items like Leggings of Murderous Intent and the Telonius Pendant. Like this comes from a quest turn-in, kind of like the Mag head. It's kind of like the Kael'thas orb, which is like the Kael'thas head, like an Onyxia head. So you only get 1 per raid, and lots of people are going to want this, and it's just a waste on you as a rogue. So I wouldn't worry about this. I wouldn't worry about the Thalassian Wilder Cloak. Again, an item that's BIS for a lot of people, but just isn't even better than the Shade of Iran Cloak. Leggings of Murderous Intent, again, BIS for almost all the melee, and they're just not even that good for rogue. So I would just make sure you're not going for some of these items that are really good for other classes, because it was just a waste on you. There's some other items. Again, the Boots of Utter Darkness, worse than Edgewalker Long Boots, but these are crafted, and you have to be a leather worker because they're buying on pickup anyway. And then lastly, there's a Resilience Ring. I mean, PvP item, but not even a super great one at that, to be honest, because you can just get the rings from Honor. I also wanted to list out the weapons. So just so you guys had an idea of what the other weapons are that drop, you've got the Talon of the Phoenix, you've got Dragon Strike, Rod of the Sun King, and Fang of Vash. So going through them quickly, Talon of Ashara, the sword is better than all of these, except potentially Rod of the Sun King if its proc rate is nuts and way better than we expect. But that's extremely unlikely. We don't have, back in the day, original TBC, people were not fawning over this thing having a crazy proc rate. It's supposed to have a pretty low proc rate and not be best in slot in rating. So Rod of the Sun King, the Town of the Phoenix and Dragon Strike ultimately are just items that are not best in slot. They'd be temporary upgrades, and you'd want to go for Talon of Ashara as your end plan. Now, these are items that are good for other classes as well, so you could try and get these as a temporary upgrade if the sword is just not dropping. But keep in mind that Town of the Phoenix is going to be a great item for enhancement shamans. It can be decent it'd be better for a warrior than you anyway, but it can be decent for warrior. Rod of the Sun King is going to be good in the offhand for both those classes and could even temporarily be used in the main hand for both as well. So these are items that, everything but the dagger, our other classes are going to want these, and it's really not worth aiming for. Even Dragon Strike, you might be like, oh, I'll just craft Dragon Strike. Well, that's not how it works anymore. It's not a personal crafting item. You actually have to get kind of like the primal nethers in dungeons. There's these new things called nether vortexes in raids, and it's not just everyone doesn't get them. You have to choose who gets them. So as a guild, they would have to be dedicating nether vortexes to you to make Dragon Strike, which isn't even best in slot. So that would potentially not be something that would be, super worthwhile. But long story short, go for Talon of Ashara. But there's other cool options available if you're able to snag them. The Claw of the Phoenix, this is the offhand. This is like a neat item for PvP or something. But yeah, again, you'd rather have Latros as a sword in the offhand because the sword spec procs are actually better than having a fist weapon in the offhand. All right, so that's kind of the overview of the gear. The last thing I want to do in this video is kind of just cover why we're going to pick certain pieces of Death Mantle. And then in the next video, I'm going to go through kind of how I would rank prioritizing all the different items in Tier 5 as a rogue. So the first thing is going to be, which pieces of Death Mantle are even good. So Death Mantle gloves are ridiculously good. They're nuts. They're the best piece of tier. Now, the only caveat is that the Wastewalker 2 set is super powerful. So if you have Wastewalker's shoulders and gloves, which is the best combo right now in tier 4, even if you get the Death Mantle handguards, your damage is kind of going to be the same if you don't have a different pair of shoulders. So despite the fact that Death Mantle handguards are insanely good on their own, like just looking at them, they're crazy compared to the other gloves, the Wastewalker set is so strong that even if you just get the gloves, it's kind of like a wash, right? You're not really gaining much or losing much if you equip them and break your Wastewalker 2 set. But if you're able to get the Death Mantle gloves and a pair of shoulders, then you've got a big upgrade on your hands, and it's actually going to be, a big increase to your damage. So keep that in mind for the gloves and the shoulders, that until you actually break your Wastewalker, it's not a massive upgrade. And then this is where things get even more weird. The legs are not best in slot either individually. These are actually worse than Skulker's Greaves and kind of the same as even tier 4 legs. And so you get into this weird situation where, and especially if you're engineering, because the engineering helm is basically the same thing as the Death Mantle helm too. So you can get in a weird situation where if you're an engineer and you decide to craft your engineering helm, the tier gloves are not an upgrade if you still have your Wastewalker. You have to get gloves and shoulders to break it. The legs aren't an upgrade. The head is basically the same thing. You get this weird situation where only the chest would be a big upgrade, whether the offset or the tier chest. But at the same time, the tier 4 set is so powerful that you eventually want to get it, because once you assemble the 4 set, it's nuts good. So the gearing for Rogue is going to be really weird, and it's really going to depend on just, I guess, how stuff is dropping, because to be honest with you, I wouldn't put a lot of value in tier at all if the 4 set didn't exist. But because its existence, you really do need 4 pieces of tier, and they're hard to get. Lots of classes want them. So that's kind of the idea of how all the pieces work, and why you're using the 4 set. And also individually, a lot of them are not even amazing. But with that said, I'll now, I guess, talk about which 4 pieces you choose. So I kind of explained each of the 4 pieces and how they kind of work. Now, if you're looking at a best in slot gearing point of view, the best offset piece to pair with the 4 pieces of Death Mantle, because again, assuming you're going to use 4, because the set bonus is crazy, you have 1 slot of the 5 that's going to be unoccupied with a tier piece, and you're going to use an offset piece. Now, you're generally going to choose between the Bloodseed Brigand Vest and Shoulders of the Stranger. You could use Skulker's Greaves, and it wouldn't be the worst thing ever, but it is definitely the worst combo of the three that I'll talk about. Now, if you choose to use the Bloodseed Brigand Vest, you're going to get more hit rating, and your build is just going to be, your hit's going to go up. If you use the shoulder pads of the Stranger, it has no hit on it. It has expertise instead. Your hit's going to go down. Now, when you look at it on paper, the chest is better, and the shoulders are not as good as the chest unless you're having trouble with hit and you have too much hit, in which case reducing your hit actually ends up netting you damage. So it's a little complicated. Long story short, chest is better in a vacuum. Shoulders, depending on your gear set, can be about as good. I would mainly go for the chest for a different reason than the actual stats on the armor. I would recommend going for the chest because I think it is easier to get the Bloodseed Brigand chest and the tier shoulders than it would be to get the shoulder pads of the Stranger and the tier chest. And let me explain why. So if you look at the Death Mantle shoulder pad, it comes from a piece of tier that is going to be Rogue, Paladin, Shaman. If you look at the different specs that are going to be for Paladin and Shaman, prop Paladins do not use this piece of shoulder gear. Enhancement Shamans do not use this piece of shoulder gear. The Resto Shamans are going to use, and Holy Paladins are going to use it, but the Rep Paladins don't use this. Prop Paladins, I think I listed them a couple duplicate times there, but long story short, way less people need this shoulder token. Really only Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman are going to need it along with Rogue for certain, and mainly those physical classes in Ret and Enhance are going to use shoulder pads of the Stranger, and then you're also going to see that Prop Paladins don't swap it out. So that just means it's easier for you to get the tier piece because there's only a couple specs that need it, right? Rogue, Holy Paladin, and Resto Shaman. In Elemental, again, I think I might have mentioned it once already, but Elemental continues to use their tier 4 2 set, so they don't need the shoulders either. Now, if I were to look at the chest is BIS for basically everyone on the token, unfortunately. Resto Shamans want it, Enhanced Shamans want it as long as they're going for 4 set. If not, they would go for the chest. Rep Paladins want the chest. Prop Paladins wouldn't go for the chest, but Resto Shamans would go for the chest. Holy Paladins go for the chest. Basically, everybody wants the chest except for your Prop Paladin. So, actually, I believe the Prop Paladin might use it as well. Either way, either everyone or all but one need the chest. So it's extremely, extremely contested. And we just looked at the shoulder. The shoulder's not very contested. Then if we look at the individual pieces themselves, shoulder pads of the Stranger are best in slot for pretty much every physical DPS because they need the expertise. Whereas the Bloodseed Brigand Vest is only truly best in slot for a Fury Warrior and a Rogue, as well as a Feral DPS, which aren't always super common. So it's easier to get Bloodseed Brigand Vest, in my opinion. And again, we'll see when all the full BIS list comes out. Always can take a look at what people in your guild are shooting for too. But I think you'll find that the Bloodseed Brigand Vest is going to be easier to get than the shoulders of the Stranger. And you're also going to see that the Death Mantle shoulders should be easier to get than the Death Mantle chest. So that's the main reason why I would recommend going for the offset chest instead of the tier chest and using the other 4 pieces of Death Mantle. It's just less competition, easier to get. And because it is such a potent 4 set, you do want to go for, you do want to get it as soon as you can. But that's pretty much it for this video. Again, I'm splitting the video off into a couple parts because you can see it's already running long. There's a ton to gearing in this phase. It's pretty complicated. There's going to be a lot of loot competition. I mean, this belt's going to be highly contested. The gun, you have to wait for hunters. The sword, some Fury Warriors might want this thing. The rings, there is competition on the rings as well, especially Band of Ranger General. The tier is going to be highly contested. I mean, it's just across the board, so much competition. So in the next video, I'm going to be talking about the item priority, the order in which you should try and shoot for items. But this video is to give you an idea how long each item is going to last, what you're going for with your gearing, when you're replacing certain items. So hopefully that helped. And I see you guys in the next video on the priority for these items.